Welcome to another edition of Eye on the Issues. Today we are talking marijuana, a big change this week in Washington, D.C. with President Trump. We'll cover that in a minute. Right now we're joined by Jordan Davidson. He is the Director of Government Affairs for Smart Approaches to Marijuana. Jordan, thanks for taking the time.
Mike, thanks so much for having me.
You bet. Let's begin by talking about something else besides what we're going to get to in a second.
Yeah.
Closing the loophole in the Farm Bill. For the average American, what does that mean?
Yeah, so Mike, in 2018, the Farm Bill, which is really kind of the big agriculture package that the government passes every few years, legalized hemp. Hemp is a plant. It's almost the exact same plant as marijuana. The only difference is it has really low levels of THC. THC is what you can think of the almost active ingredient in marijuana, the part of it that gets you high. And so we thought we're going to legalize this because it can't get you high, but we can make rope out of it. We can make ointments that aren't intoxicating, and it's going to be great. But what people didn't realize was you can actually derive synthetic variations of THC from this plant. One of the most popular ones is called Delta 8. Some people might, even listening to your show, might have seen that in different convenience stores, gas stations, vape shops. They're all over. And it's exactly the same as marijuana, except with no rules, no regulations, no age limit, nothing. And so overnight, a new industry developed wherein, to start with, in all 50 states, you had essentially legal marijuana where a 10-year-old could buy THC laced in Oreos at a 7-Eleven, and the federal government said that was perfectly fine. As you can imagine, this created a really huge crisis. Thousands of young people going to the emergency rooms. There was a 4-year-old in Virginia who died because of these products. Terrible consequences. And so there was in Congress really a kind of a reckoning with this and a recognition that these products should not be on the market. They should not be on the shelves anywhere. And so after several years, basically I guess 7 years since 2018, we finally, in the bill to open up the federal government after the shutdown, President Trump signed a bill into law that would ban these products everywhere, nationwide. And that was a long, kind of hard path. But in the Senate, notably, we got 3/4 of the United States Senate to vote standalone on this issue. And it was a really amazing win for public health and American families.
Did that ban go into effect right away? And if not, what's the effective date?
Yeah. So I will say we got pretty much everything we wanted in there, except for one thing, which is the hemp industry got a 1-year implementation delay. So this will go into effect in November of 2026. And so right now, what our game plan is we are going knocking on each door, one after another, of each state legislature, telling them, hey, the federal government has signed this into law. This is an overwhelmingly popular provision. And we want you to adopt the federal law into the state code so you don't get left behind, because states don't want the DEA coming into their state to enforce the federal law over something that people in their state actually don't even want. So that's what our plan is, and kind of staving off the hemp industry's attempt to reverse this before that delay implementation kind of ends.
On December 18th, this month, obviously, Donald Trump signed an executive order that was put in place shifting marijuana from a Schedule I substance to Schedule III. Talk about why that is a big deal.
Yeah, that's a huge deal, Mike. And it's really disappointing. It's disappointing from President Trump. You know, his whole life on camera to his kids, he said, don't do drugs, don't drink alcohol, don't smoke cigarettes. And that's really been his mantra. And I think there was a lot of literally fake news on this issue coming in from a lot of outside folks into the White House. So what happened yesterday was President Trump signed an executive order to expedite the process to reschedule marijuana. That was an initiative started by the Biden administration, actually, in 2022, and is continuing now. And so what are really the practical effects of that? I will go into in a second, but I think it's first important to dispel one or two myths that are often associated with kind of what drug scheduling even means. The thing I hear almost every day is marijuana is in the same category as heroin. That's crazy. That doesn't make any sense. I'm not going to be here telling you that marijuana is as bad as a drug like heroin, but the difference is scheduling of drugs is not a harm index. It's not what drug is most likely to kill you is in Schedule 1. It actually mixes kind of criminal justice elements with the medical system. So Schedule 1 drugs are ones that have a high potential for abuse, and we know that marijuana has a 30% addiction rate in people who use it, and no medical value. That's not saying you can't derive a compound from marijuana that might be formulated into a medication in a certain delivery mechanism. This is just saying smoking a rolled up marijuana joint, that's not medication. There's no drug called marijuana. And so it meets that definition of Schedule 1. Now on to kind of what rescheduling means. There are, I'd say 3 to 4 distinct harms. First, marijuana rescheduling is just going to normalize marijuana. It's just going to send a message to our kids that the drug is safer than ever and that it is something that, people should use, when in fact that couldn't be further from the truth. Marijuana today is far, far more potent than the marijuana of our parents and grandparents, the 1970s Woodstock weed. It's upwards of 99% potent today. And that is just shocking, and it's having devastating effects. So that's number one. Number two, this rescheduling will give a giant tax break to the marijuana industry. There's a part of our tax code that actually says if you're in the business of trafficking a Schedule 1 or a Schedule 2 drug, you can't deduct business expenses or get tax credits like other businesses that are actually legal operators, legal businesses. Yet you'll notice it said Schedule 1 and 2 only. So the marijuana industry wants Schedule 3 specifically. It's not an accident, because then they'll get a $2 billion plus annual federal tax cut. And that will supersize them, commercialize them. They'll be able to write off things like advertising and marketing kid-friendly products. And it's going to be devastating. And the last two things that are going to happen with rescheduling is this is somewhat up for debate and kind of seeing what's going to happen here. But there's a lot of thought out there from the Department of Transportation that because the laboratories that are used for drug testing for pilots and truck drivers, safety sensitive industries, a lot of those labs aren't actually registered to test for Schedule 3 drugs. Only Schedule 1 and 2. And so there's a concern that we won't even be able to test pilots and truck drivers for whether they're under the influence of marijuana while they're doing operating vehicles. And finally, Mike, you or your viewers might have seen this crazy, almost stranger than fiction story of Chinese marijuana farms popping up across the country. Chinese criminal cartels, criminal organizations are actually opening up marijuana farms across the country. It's an essential part, the DEA tells us, of actually the fentanyl trade, because Latin American drug cartels kind of outsource their money laundering to Chinese organized crime. And they use these marijuana farms as part of a link in that chain. And the second thing that's come out about them, Mike, is that a lot of these farms are state licensed. They've basically hoodwinked state governments and gotten official licenses. So guess what happens? Those Chinese criminal organizations, they get a tax break too. They get a tax break on the American people. And that's going to be terrible for all things drug trafficking and all things in a kind of fight against China.
And one of those states being that you're talking about with marijuana and the Chinese is Oklahoma, for example.
Yeah.
I talked to some drug enforcement officials up there recently about that, and they say it is a huge deal in their state.
Oh. It's terrible. They are everywhere. I'll tell you a brief, insane anecdote just to highlight the craziness of this. If your listeners can visualize this, I was talking to a staff member on Capitol Hill whose boss worked as an Oklahoma congressman, and she said, "Jordan, I have to tell you a crazy story. When I went home to Oklahoma, my cousin, who's a real estate agent, said, 'Hey, I want you to come on a visit to a house with me in rural Oklahoma.' She got to the house, and there were a dozen Chinese businessmen in suits and briefcases in rural Oklahoma. And they start going in the house and they go to the second floor, and she starts hearing this noise, and they're jumping up and down on the floorboards. And she said, 'What are they doing?' And she said, 'They're seeing how strong the floorboards are, because that's where they're gonna put all their machinery for the marijuana grow operation they're setting up here.' I mean, it's truly unbelievable.
Yep. Grow houses, grow neighborhoods. I mean, they go out there and they buy houses at the end of a cul-de-sac. So they own all of them.
Yes, and it's in suburban America. It's insane.
Right. Yep, it's absolutely insane. Let's go back to the rescheduling of marijuana for a second. So let's talk about the distribution and how that might change. So let's say, for example, there's a state out there, and then there are maybe 22 or so. Actually, I'm not sure of the exact number that have legalized it from a medical versus a recreational standpoint. But let's say a state that does not have marijuana legalized in any form right now, how is that going to impact them?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. First, I want to say one note I forgot before because this is super important. That the thing President Trump kept saying, the reason he kept doing this was for research, right?
I saw
There's
that.
this myth out there that says you can't research Schedule One drugs. That's actually not true. It's just a false statement. In no way, shape, or form isn't true. That would be like saying we don't know anything about heroin or about LSD because they're Schedule One drugs. That's not true. And in fact, 3 years ago, we passed a bipartisan law that actually expedites marijuana research while keeping it in Schedule One. So there's no need to do that Schedule Three. It really doesn't change anything. But back to your question about states that kind of don't have legal marijuana, what are they going to see? Well, I think the number one thing they're going to see is they're going to see young people that are taking this message that marijuana is now safer than ever, and that they should be using it. I think the other thing that they'll see is a problem that I have actually talked with law enforcement in different states without legal marijuana is they're really puzzled as to what to do with the interstate commerce issue, right? So imagine you have a state, a state like Wyoming, for example, right, where you have no legal marijuana, but you have kind of California nearby, you have Nevada nearby, you have Washington nearby, Oregon nearby, these states of Montana with legal marijuana. What happens when you start getting essentially what I think are drug traffickers transporting marijuana through Wyoming? Through New Hampshire, that's an issue up there as well. What happens when people drop legal weed into a state with no legal marijuana? Well, that state is saying, we don't want this here, but it's still coming through their state and it's still a big problem. There's still drug trafficking occurring. And so with Schedule 3, we're going to see a massive expansion of the marijuana industry, especially with those tax cuts. They're going to have more dispensaries open. They're going to have more manufacturing operations. They're going to have more grow houses and farms in the states in which marijuana is legal. It will embolden the illegal actors like these Chinese organized criminal groups that are operating everywhere. And I think you're going to see an increased amount of trafficking in states that actually don't have any legal marijuana and don't want it at all.
One of the most important things, and you mentioned it before, is the difference in the potency and the strength of marijuana today versus in 1975, for example. Talk about that for a second. And how did we get to where we are now? Because clearly there haven't been any restrictions stopping it.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's this interesting thing that the pro drug people like to throw out, and they call it the iron law of prohibition. And the theory is if you prohibit a substance, it actually gets more potent. Because they have to, like in alcohol prohibition, they made moonshine, right? Because they wanted to get almost the best bang for your buck. Where that might have been true a century ago, but we're actually seeing that it's the opposite now, and we call it the iron law of liberalization and legalization. You saw this, in fact, with cigarettes, right? Cigarettes didn't kill anyone, or tobacco, I should say, didn't kill anyone until about the turn of the century. And why was that? It was because of the invention of the cigarette, right? They kind of maximized addiction. They had actual companies that are operating kind of a for-profit, kind of free market environment. And the free market's great for many things, but addictive vices aren't one of them. And so with marijuana, you're seeing the same exact thing in the 60s and the 70s when it kind of was just like the hippies on college campuses that were smoking marijuana. It was about 2 to 4% THC potency. And then what happened? In the 1990s, billionaires, including actually George Soros, got involved in spending hundreds of millions in drug legalization advocacy, in R&D, and in companies and PR firms that are designed to kind of promote marijuana and genetically modify marijuana to be as potent as possible. And because there's this great kind of infrastructure with a profit incentive to do so, they're making the products even more potent on purpose. This isn't some accident of nature. It's purposeful by these companies. And what they're looking at is they're following what's called the Pareto rule, the 80-20 rule, that about 80% in addiction industries, it's the same for, cigarettes or alcohol, or anything else, pharma companies, 80% of the profit is actually coming from 20% of the consumers. They're banking on that person to get addicted to marijuana and keep coming back and buying more. And they do that by making it more potent and more addictive.
And let's just humor me for a second. Let's compare. What if the
Yeah.
potency of a beer in 1975 went to the multiplier, whatever that was, of how marijuana got that much stronger? where I mean, people would be barely able to have half a beer, if that, probably, right?
Yeah, no, it's and I get the alcohol thing all the time, right? Well, what about alcohol? You're a shill for alcohol. I'm actually so Mike, I'm actually in addiction recovery myself. I just celebrated 7 years of sobriety from all substances.
Congratulations.
I thank you so much. I don't drink alcohol, right? And alcohol is sort of the train has really left the station on that one, in terms of like how widespread it is, and that's a whole separate conversation. But your point is well taken. What we're seeing is marijuana at potency levels that are just insane. I mean, if you think about it, the type of marijuana that people are smoking, it is as if on a daily basis people are drinking moonshine, right? It's really crazy. And what we're also seeing is, and it's an interesting to kind of compare. I say that we need drug control policies for all things, and including alcohol, but we have to recognize where drugs are different. Right. And so one of the, and it's not just comparing to alcohol, it's actually comparing to other drugs as well. Marijuana has a really unique cultural role where 1 in 2 people who report using marijuana in the past month are using it every day. That is a shocking number of people who are daily users. There are actually more daily users of marijuana today than daily alcohol drinkers, even though there are far more people who reported, yeah, I drink a beer at least once in the past year versus, yeah, I smoked weed at least once in the past year. And so there's this like culture of consumption and constant consumption that is, in my opinion, like extra dangerous.
That is very disturbing, without question. Is there anything you want to add about this topic that I'm not asking you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that with marijuana rescheduling, I would say to people kind of like do your research on it. There's a lot of kind of lines that are put out there, a little bit of rhetoric, and at the end of the day, this was driven by marijuana CEOs. They're not nameless. The chief among them is Kim Rivers, who's the CEO of True Leave, which is the biggest marijuana company in the United States. She has spent so much money. She spent of her own company's money $150 million to try and legalize marijuana in Florida. Her donation alone made that ballot measure in 2024 the most expensive ballot measure in American history, even without any other donations. They're trying to buy these ballot elections, and she actually failed because the people of Florida recognized it's not what they wanted and burned $150 million. And so this is about making the rich marijuana CEOs richer. This is not about public health. This is not about public safety. And I will say, if anyone out there has concerns about research, concerns about criminal justice, even no criminal penalties change as a result of this order, and rarely any research changes either. So all that will happen is more people using a drug that's increasingly more dangerous, and that's going to be bad for America.
And for people that want to learn more about this, can they go to your website, and where can they go?
Yeah, absolutely. So our organization is called Smart Approaches to Marijuana, or SAM. Our website is learnaboutsam.org. And that's also our Twitter page where we post a lot of different information. And please check us out. And my email is jordan@learnaboutsam.org, and reach out if you kind of want to get involved in this issue.
Fantastic, Jordan. Thank you for that. Folks out there, if you want to learn more about what's happening around the state of Wyoming and across the nation, really, just go to wyliberty.org. Sign up for our newsletter. Jordan, thanks again.
Yes, Mike. Actually, wait, one more note.
Sure.
Wyoming, the people of Wyoming should be very proud because 50 members of Congress signed a letter to 22 senators, 26 House members, 2 different letters to oppose marijuana rescheduling, actually coming out against President Trump's action. Both senators from Wyoming signed that letter. So you guys should be very proud that Senators Barrasso and Lummis did that.
Without question. Jordan, thanks again.
Thanks so much, Mike.